Tonight's stories all came from the same place, the Appalachian Mountains. For generations, people who've lived there have passed down warnings about places you don't go, trails you don't follow, and things you're better off pretending you never saw. Some call them old legends. Others swear they're true. The 4 stories you're about to hear were all sent to me by people who asked to remain anonymous. As always, names and locations have been changed. Whether you believe what happened is entirely up to you. So tonight, find somewhere comfortable. Turn the lights down. And if you're listening before bed, maybe don't wander too far into the woods in your dreams. This is 1 hour of Appalachian horror. Let's begin. Tonight's story was sent to me by someone who asked to remain anonymous. As always, names and locations have been changed. Whether you believe what happened is entirely up to you. I've been a land surveyor for a little over 11 years. It's not the sort of job people ask about at barbecues, and if we're doing it properly, most people never even notice we're there. Our job is simple. Find old property boundaries. Check survey markers. Make sure the maps still match the land beneath your feet. After enough years, you stop second-guessing your equipment. GPS can fail. Batteries die. People make mistakes. But if you take your time and check everything twice, the numbers always lead you back to the truth. At least, that's what I believed. A couple of years ago, my company won a contract in the Appalachian Mountains. A timber company had bought several adjoining parcels of forest and wanted every property boundary verified before they started logging. Most of the original survey markers had been placed almost a century earlier, so our job was to locate each one and compare it against the old records. It sounded like one of the easiest jobs we'd had all year. I was paired with a surveyor named Mark. Mark had been doing the job for decades. He wasn't unfriendly, just quiet. The kind of bloke who never spoke unless he had something worth saying. If Mark offered an opinion, people usually listened. The only strange thing happened before we even left the office. He unfolded the survey map, studied one section for a few seconds, then quietly folded it shut again. I asked if he'd worked that area before. Years ago, he said. That was all. The drive took most of the morning. Once we left the highway, the roads narrowed quickly. Bitumen turned to gravel. Gravel turned to dirt. Before long, we were following an old forestry track that looked like it hadn't seen maintenance in years. By the time we parked the truck, there wasn't another vehicle anywhere in sight. No phone reception, no traffic. Just ridge after ridge of dense forest. We checked the weather, loaded our gear, and started walking. The first survey marker was exactly where it was supposed to be. A weathered granite monument, half buried beneath moss and leaves. I brushed the top clean, confirmed the survey mark, logged the coordinates, and moved on. The second marker matched perfectly. So did the third. By early afternoon, we'd settled into the usual rhythm. Walk. Measure. Record. Repeat. Then we reached the fourth marker. I set up the total station while Mark uncovered the monument. The instrument finished calculating. 417.3 meters. I checked the original field notes. The recorded distance was 423.1. Almost 6 meters out. I frowned. That wasn't impossible. Old surveys drift occasionally. I reset the instrument and measured again. The reading barely changed. I checked the level. Ran the measurement a third time. Still the same. That's strange, I said. Mark looked through the instrument himself, then compared the reading with the original survey. He didn't seem surprised. Wouldn't be the first old survey to be a little off. It was a reasonable explanation. At least, it sounded like one. So we logged the discrepancy and kept walking. 20 minutes later, the next marker was wrong too. Different distance. Different direction. That's when I stopped thinking it was a surveying error. I looked over at Mark. He wasn't looking at the equipment anymore. He was staring into the trees. "Everything all right?" I asked. He didn't answer straight away. Instead, he folded the survey notes, slipped them back into his backpack, and looked further into the forest. "We've done enough for today." I checked my watch. "It's not even 4. I know." "Then why are we stopping?" Mark didn't look at me. He kept staring into the trees. Then, almost under his breath, he said, Those lines don't always stay where you leave them. I waited for him to explain what he meant. He didn't. He just adjusted the strap on his backpack and started walking back the way we'd come. I stood there for a second, looking between him and the survey marker. "Mark," he stopped. "What did you mean? Those lines don't stay where you leave them?" He looked back at me. "I mean exactly what I said. That's not an answer." He sighed. "No, it isn't." The walk back to the truck was quiet. Not awkward. Just quiet. Every now and then I'd catch Mark looking over his shoulder. Never for long, but often enough that I started doing it too. I never saw anything. Back at the truck, we packed away the equipment and drove into the nearest town. Over dinner, I tried bringing it up again. "Those measurements today, have you seen that before?" Mark took a sip of his coffee before answering. "I've seen plenty of bad surveys. That's not what I'm asking." He looked out the diner window for a moment. "No. Then what's going on?" "I don't know." It was the first answer he'd given all day that sounded completely honest. The next morning, we headed back up the mountain. I expected Mark to be just as reluctant as he'd been the afternoon before. Instead, he seemed determined, almost impatient. We reached the fourth marker just after 10, the one that had been almost 6 meters out. I set up the total station, checked the level, took the measurement. 423.1, exactly what the original survey recorded. I stared at the display. That wasn't possible. I checked it again. Same result. Mark. He didn't say anything. He was already writing in his notebook. Yesterday, this was 6 meters out. I know. Now it's right. I know. I walked back to the previous marker. Reset the instrument. Measured the line again. Still perfect. Every reading matched the original survey. Every one. It was as though yesterday had never happened. I looked at my notebook. The numbers I'd written the day before were still there. 417.3. I'd written them myself. I'd checked them 3 times. Now the land was telling me a different story. I looked up at Mark. He closed his notebook. "We're not finished." "What do you mean?" He pointed further up the ridge. "There's one marker left." I checked the map. He was right. One final boundary monument. It sat almost a kilometer beyond the surveyed property, tucked inside a section of forest neither of us had any reason to enter. I frowned. Why would they place one all the way out there? Mark didn't answer. He just started walking. After a few seconds, I followed. The climb became steeper the further we went. Before long, there wasn't any sign of an old trail. Just rocks, fallen timber, and thick undergrowth that forced us to slow down. According to the survey map, the final monument should have been less than 300 meters away. We walked almost twice that distance before either of us spoke. I remember checking the GPS more than once, convinced we'd missed a turn somewhere. Everything insisted we were heading in the right direction. It just didn't feel like we were getting any closer. Eventually, the trees began to thin. Not gradually, almost all at once. The forest opened into a small clearing, no bigger than a suburban backyard. The ground was strangely bare. No ferns, no thick scrub, just old leaves lying across hard-packed earth. It was the first place we'd seen all day where sunlight reached the ground. Mark stopped walking. He didn't look surprised. He just looked disappointed, as though he'd hoped this place no longer existed. Without saying a word, he nodded toward the center of the clearing. At first, I couldn't see anything. Then I noticed it. A granite survey monument, about waist high, standing perfectly upright. It looked newer than every other marker we'd found that week. The edges were sharp. The surface was almost clean. It didn't belong there. I walked over and brushed away a handful of leaves. There was no survey stamp, no government markings, nothing that identified who had placed it there. Just 3 straight lines carved into the top. They met in the center like the points of a compass. I'd never seen that symbol before. I asked Mark if he recognized it. He took his time before answering. Then he quietly admitted he did. He'd seen it once before, on this same mountain, more than 20 years earlier. His old supervisor had told him to leave immediately. No explanation, no report. Just pack up and go. Mark said they never spoke about it again. I laughed. Not because I thought it was funny, because it was the only thing that made sense to do. The whole story sounded ridiculous. A forgotten survey marker, an old symbol, a supervisor who refused to explain himself. There had to be a logical answer, so I did what I'd been trained to do. I set up the equipment. If the monument was real, the measurements would prove it. The total station locked onto the prism almost instantly. I checked the level, confirmed the coordinates. Then I took the reading. The distance appeared on the screen. I looked at it once. Then again. I checked every setting before taking the measurement a second time. The result didn't change. According to my equipment, the monument wasn't standing in the clearing. It was almost 93 meters beneath it. I checked everything again. The batteries, the calibration, the prism. Nothing was wrong. I looked at Mark. He wasn't looking at the instrument. He was looking at the trees surrounding the clearing. Very quietly, he said, "Pack it up." This time, I didn't argue. I packed the equipment without taking my eyes off the monument. Every instinct I had told me to take another measurement, to prove the instrument was wrong, to prove there was still a logical explanation. Instead, I followed Mark back through the trees. Neither of us spoke until we reached the truck. The drive back to town was almost silent. That night, I copied every measurement into my field notebook. Then I entered the same figures into my laptop. I checked them twice before going to bed. I didn't want to rely on memory. I wanted evidence. The next morning, we drove back to the office. I opened the survey files, compared my notes with the digital records, and immediately felt my stomach drop. The impossible measurements were gone. Every distance now matched the original survey from almost a century earlier. Exactly. Down to the centimeter. I opened my notebook. Those numbers had changed, too. The figures I'd written in the field were no longer there. In their place were the correct measurements, as though the impossible readings had never existed. I checked every photo we'd taken on the mountain. The clearing was there. The trees were there. But the granite monument had disappeared. There wasn't even disturbed soil where it had been standing. Nothing. Every piece of evidence agreed with the new measurements. Everything except my memory. For days I convinced myself I'd imagined it. Maybe exhaustion had got the better of me. Maybe I'd made a mistake and refused to admit it. It wasn't a satisfying explanation, but it was the only one I had. 3 days later, I was unpacking my backpack before another job. At the bottom of one of the side pockets, I found a small piece of granite, about the size of a golf ball. One side had been cut perfectly flat. Carved into the surface were 3 straight lines meeting in the center. The same symbol. I don't remember picking it up. I don't remember putting it in my bag. I still have it. It's locked in a drawer at home. Every now and then I think about throwing it away. I never do. 6 months after that job, Mark retired. Neither of us ever mentioned the mountain again. Not because we'd agreed to keep quiet, because there wasn't anything left to say. I still work as a surveyor. I still trust my equipment. I still trust mathematics. Most days. But every now and then I'll find an old strip of orange survey ribbon tied around a tree where I know there wasn't one before. I don't stop to investigate anymore. I just keep walking. Some things aren't meant to be measured, and some boundaries were never meant to be crossed. If that story really happened, I don't think the mountain was haunted. I think it was protecting something. Whatever stood beneath that clearing had been hidden long before either of us were born. And I can't help wondering whether the marker was ever meant to keep people out or keep something else in. If you enjoyed tonight's story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to Cole After Dark. It really helps the channel, and I'd love to have you back for the next one. If you've ever experienced something you still can't explain, leave a comment below or send it through the email in the description. Your story might feature in a future episode. Until next time, sleep well. And if you ever find yourself following an old property line through the mountains, keep your eyes on the markers. Good night.
Tonight's story was sent to me by someone who asked to remain anonymous. As always, names and locations have been changed. Whether you believe it is entirely up to you. I used to spend my summers alone in the Appalachian Mountains. Whenever I tell people that now, they usually ask if I ever got lonely. The truth is, loneliness was never the problem. My name's Drew. At least, that's the name I'll use here. I was 22 years old when I took a seasonal job as a volunteer fire lookout in eastern Kentucky. I just finished college. I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. A friend mentioned the Forestry Service was looking for extra eyes during wildfire season. And I figured, why not? It sounded peaceful. 3 months in the mountains, no traffic, no cities, no emails, just trees, endless trees. The tower sat on top of a ridge called Laurel Gap. Getting there took almost an hour. The last 15 minutes were along a dirt forestry road that was barely wide enough for the old pickup they gave me. Once I unlocked the gate, there was nobody else. No visitors, no hikers, no cabins, nothing. Just the tower. It stood above the tree line like a lonely skeleton of rusted steel. 93 metal steps climbed to a small observation room at the top. By the end of my first week, I could climb every one of them without stopping. Every evening followed exactly the same routine. Unlock the tower, climb the steps, switch on the radio, check the weather, make a pot of coffee, write the visibility into the logbook. Then, I watched the sun disappear behind the mountains. People imagine the Appalachian Mountains as dark and intimidating. During the day, they're anything but. The ridges roll on forever, layer after layer, fading from deep green into soft blue until they disappear into the horizon. Some evenings, the clouds settled in the valleys below me. It felt less like I was standing on a mountain, and more like I was floating above the world. After sunset, everything changed. The birds disappeared first. Then the insects grew quieter. Eventually, there was only the wind. It would push gently against the tower, just enough to make the steel creak every now and then. At first, that sound kept me awake. By the second week, I barely noticed it. Midnight became my favorite time. The air cooled, the sky filled with more stars than I'd ever seen. On clear nights, I could make out tiny lights from distant farms miles away. Every hour, I'd radio headquarters. Laurel Gap lookout, routine check, no smoke observed. They'd answer. I'd write the time in the logbook. Then everything would go quiet again. I loved that silence. These days, people pay for meditation apps to find a little peace. Back then, I had an entire mountain to myself. Nothing unusual happened for almost 3 weeks. No fires, no storms, no emergencies, just quiet nights, and the occasional owl somewhere below the tower. Then, late one Friday night, I noticed something I'd never seen before. Another light. At first, I barely gave it a second thought. It was far away, just a tiny white beacon blinking across the mountains. I remember leaning against the window, watching it flash through the darkness. Slow, steady, almost identical to the beacon on my own tower. I actually smiled. I figured there must have been another lookout stationed somewhere west of Laurel Gap. Strange. I'd somehow never noticed it before. I remember thinking, tomorrow, I'll ask who's working that tower. Because after 3 weeks alone, it was nice to think there might finally be someone else out there. The next morning, I brought it up over coffee. There were only 3 of us at the ranger station that day. Me. A woman named Karen who handled most of the radio traffic. and an older ranger called Frank. Frank had worked those mountains longer than I'd been alive. If anyone knew every fire tower in the county, it was him. I poured myself another coffee, sat down, and asked the question as casually as I could. "So, who's working the tower west of Laurel Gap?" Karen frowned. "What tower?" "The one across the valley." I pointed through the window. "You can see its beacon from my lookout." She looked at Frank. Frank looked at me. Neither of them said anything for a few seconds. Then Frank asked, "What did you say you saw?" "A fire tower." He shook his head. "No. I watched the beacon for almost 2 hours." "No, Drew. There isn't another lookout over there." I laughed. "I've seen it twice now." Frank didn't laugh back. Instead, he stood up, walked over to an old filing cabinet, opened one of the bottom drawers. He pulled out a folded forestry map that looked older than I was. The paper had yellowed with age. The edges were torn. He spread it across the table. Then he tapped a finger against the western ridges. "There," he said quietly. "There used to be one." I looked closer. Printed in faded ink was a tiny square. Beside it, 3 words: West Ridge Lookout. "It burned down?" I asked. Frank slowly folded the map shut. "No. They dismantled it." "When?" He thought for a moment. 1978. I remember smiling. Not because anything was funny, because I assumed I'd solved the mystery. Maybe there was still an old beacon. Maybe another department used it. Maybe I'd mistaken something else for a tower. There had to be an explanation. There always is. That evening, I climbed my 93 steps like I always did. Coffee, weather log, radio check, no smoke observed. The sun disappeared. Darkness settled over the mountains. Around midnight, I found myself looking west, almost without thinking. The light appeared, right on schedule. Blink, pause, blink, pause, blink, exactly like the night before. I picked up the radio. "Laurel Gap Lookout to headquarters," Karen answered almost immediately. "Go ahead. I've got visual on that beacon again." Silence. Long enough that I checked the radio was still working. "Finally," her voice came back. "We don't have any active lookout west of your position." I know what Frank said. "I'm telling you, it's there." Another pause. Then, "Drew, log what you see. We'll discuss it in the morning." That was it. No questions, no concern. Just log what you see. So I did. Time, weather, visibility. One unidentified beacon observed west of Laurel Gap. Nothing more. The following morning, before anyone else arrived, I spread 3 different maps across the station table. The current forestry map, a topographical survey, even an old tourist map I'd found in a cupboard. Every road was marked, every hiking trail, every creek, every fire tower. West Ridge Lookout didn't exist. Not anymore. I wasn't scared, not even a little. I was curious. So, I started a new page in my notebook. At the top, I wrote 1 sentence. Unknown beacon. Then I drew the ridgeline exactly as I saw it for the tower. I marked where the light appeared, added the date, the time, the weather. Then I closed the notebook. I had no idea. That tiny pencil mark would become the most important thing I'd written all summer. For the next 4 nights, I did exactly the same thing. Every hour. I logged my routine radio checks. Every midnight, I watched the western ridgeline. And every night, the beacon appeared. Always after full darkness. Always blinking at the same steady rhythm. At least, that's what I thought. On the 5th night, I opened my notebook before the light came on. I wanted to compare my sketches. Nothing more. Just satisfy my own curiosity. The first drawing looked fine. So did the second. But when I laid them side by side, something felt wrong. I counted the ridgelines again. Once, twice, 3 times. The beacon wasn't in the same place. It had shifted. Not far. Maybe half a ridge. Just enough that I thought I'd drawn it badly. So I climbed to the observation windows and waited. At exactly 12:14, the light appeared. My stomach tightened. It was sitting exactly where I'd marked it. On the newest sketch. Not the first one. The newest one. I told myself the obvious explanation. Perspective, atmospheric conditions, different visibility, anything. Anything except what my notebook was telling me. The next morning, I borrowed the station binoculars, old military surplus. Heavy enough to feel like they were made from solid steel. Frank saw me carrying them outside. "You planning on bird watching?" he asked. I smiled. "Something like that." He didn't ask another question. That night, the sky was perfectly clear. No clouds, no fog, the kind of night where you could see forever. I rested the binoculars against the window frame, waited for the beacon, and slowly focused the lenses. At first, all I could make out were trees, dark mountains, shadows. Then, the image sharpened. I remember holding my breath. It was a fire tower, not something that looked like one. A real tower. Steel legs, observation cabin, rotating beacon, almost identical to the one I was standing in. Except, it looked decades older. The paint had almost completely peeled away. Rust covered every beam. The windows looked black, like nobody had cleaned them in years. I kept staring, trying to convince myself it was abandoned. Then I noticed something. Someone was standing inside, perfectly still, just behind the glass. I couldn't make out a face, not at that distance, just a dark silhouette, watching. I lowered the binoculars, rubbed my eyes, looked again. The figure hadn't moved. I reached for the radio. Laurel Gap, lookout to headquarters. Static. I adjusted the volume, tried again. Laurel Gap, lookout to headquarters. Nothing. Just that endless hiss. For the first time all summer, the radio wasn't answering. I looked back through the binoculars. The figure was still there. Standing so still, it almost didn't seem human. Then, very slowly, the beacon stopped rotating. The light froze, and instead of sweeping across the mountains, it stayed fixed, pointing directly at my tower. I didn't sleep much after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that tower. Not because it looked abandoned, because it looked occupied. The next morning, I drove straight to the ranger station. Karen was already there. "So," she said, "you still seeing your mystery light?" I nodded. "I saw the tower." She laughed. "No. I mean through binoculars." Her smile disappeared. "You actually saw a tower." "I saw someone standing inside it." She stared at me for a moment, then quietly reached for the radio log. She flipped through a few pages, before picking up the handset. "Frank," she said, "can you come in here?" A minute later, he walked through the door. Karen looked at me. "Tell him." So I did. I told him everything. The binoculars, the figure, the beacon, the radio going dead. He didn't interrupt once. When I finished, he folded his arms, then asked me one question. "Did the light move?" I frowned. "What?" "The tower. Was it any closer?" I hadn't even answered before I knew. Yes, it was. Not by much, but enough. Frank looked down at the floor, almost like he'd expected that answer. Finally, he spoke. "When I started here," he said quietly, "the old-timers used to tell stories about West Ridge." I waited. "They said the tower was taken down." He paused. They never said it left. I laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was ridiculous. Frank, it's an old fire tower, he nodded. I know. Then he looked me straight in the eye. So why is it getting closer? Neither of us had an answer. That night, I climbed the 93 steps slower than usual. For the first time, I wasn't looking forward to being alone. The sky was different. Heavy clouds rolled over the mountains. The wind pushed against the tower hard enough to make the steel groan. By midnight, rain had started. The beacon appeared anyway, closer. Close enough that I no longer needed the binoculars to find it. I could see the outline of the tower with my own eyes. Lightning flashed across the valley. For a split second, the entire mountainside lit up. I froze. The tower wasn't standing on the far ridge anymore. It was on the next one. There should have been miles between us. Now, there couldn't have been more than one. Another flash. This time, I saw the figure, still standing inside the observation room, still perfectly motionless, watching. The rain hammered against the windows. The tower groaned beneath my feet. Then, my radio crackled to life. Drew, it was Frank. His voice sounded different, quieter, almost frightened. You need to leave. I grabbed the handset. Frank, what is happening? Static. Then, one final sentence. Whatever you do, don't let it reach your tower. The radio went dead. Outside, the beacon stopped blinking. It stayed on. A single, unbroken light, shining straight at me. I don't remember making the decision to leave. 1 second, I was standing at the observation window. The next, I was running down those 93 metal steps faster than I ever had before. The rain had turned the mountain into mud. Branches whipped against my jacket. The wind drowned out almost every sound. Almost. Because somewhere behind me, I could hear metal. A slow, hollow, creaking. The kind of sound an old steel tower makes when it sways in the wind. Except, my tower was behind me. I never looked back. I reached the truck, started the engine, and drove. I don't remember the journey down the mountain, only that I kept checking the rear-view mirror, expecting to see a light following me through the trees. Morning came without me sleeping. Around 9 o'clock, Frank knocked on my motel room door. Neither of us mentioned the radio call. Neither of us mentioned the tower. He simply looked at me and said, "If you have to know, go now." So we did. We drove back to Laurel Gap together. The storm had passed. The forest looked exactly as it always had. Quiet, still, beautiful. We climbed to the top of the lookout. Everything was normal. The coffee mug I'd left behind was still sitting on the desk. My notebook was exactly where I'd left it. Even the radio worked perfectly. It was as though nothing had happened. Frank didn't say much. He simply pointed toward the western ridge. "Show me." I did. "There." I pointed across the valley. That's where it was. He studied the trees through the binoculars for a long time. Finally, he lowered them. "There's nothing there." I borrowed the binoculars, looked for myself. Nothing. No tower, no clearing, no access road, no steel frame. Just miles of untouched forest. I wanted to feel relieved. Instead, I felt confused, because I knew what I'd seen. Before we left, I opened my notebook one last time. Every sketch was still there. Every date, every weather report, every tiny pencil mark showing the beacon getting closer. Frank looked at the pages, then quietly closed the notebook. "Don't bring this back," he said. I never asked him what he meant. I resigned that afternoon. People thought I'd found a better job. I never corrected them. A few years later, I tried searching for West Ridge Lookout online. Nothing. No photographs. No records. No mention that it had ever existed. Sometimes, I wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe I'd spent too many nights alone. Maybe exhaustion played tricks on my mind. Then I remember something. I never told anyone. The morning after the storm, before Frank arrived, I walked once around the base of my tower. The ground was still soft from the rain. There was a line of fresh boot prints leading out of the trees. They stopped at the bottom step. They never came back the other way. I stood there for a long time, trying to understand what I was looking at. Eventually, I counted them. Once, then again, just to make sure. There were 93. People always ask if I ever saw that tower again. I didn't. But sometimes, when I'm trying to sleep, I still catch myself counting to 93. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening. If you enjoyed tonight's story, I'd really appreciate it if you left a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you probably realize, and it means I can keep bringing these stories to life. And if you have your own unexplained experience, I'd love to hear it. Until next time, stay safe, sleep well, and I'll see you again after dark.
Tonight's story was sent to me by someone who asked to remain anonymous. As always, names and locations have been changed. Whether you believe it is entirely up to you. I've spent enough time in the Appalachian Mountains to know they don't need ghosts to be intimidating. The silence out there is different. It settles over everything. The trees, the valleys, even your own thoughts. Most people who visit only ever see the hiking trails, the overlooks, the campsites. They don't see the miles of untouched forest hidden beyond them. That's where I worked. My name's Ethan. About 4 years ago, I was working as a forestry survey technician for the state, and it wasn't an exciting job. Most days, I'd park the truck, sling a GPS over my shoulder, and spend 8 or 9 hours walking through the woods. I'd mark trees, record coordinates, photograph erosion, and note anything that might affect future hiking trails. It was quiet work, exactly the kind of job I wanted. For one assignment, I was sent to survey a section of forest so remote that driving back and forth every day didn't make sense. Instead, the Forestry Service gave me access to one of their old field cabins. I'd be there for 5 days, completely alone. The cabin had probably been built sometime in the 70s. It wasn't much to look at. 1 bedroom, a tiny kitchen, a wood-burning stove, a covered porch that sagged just enough to make you wonder how many winters it had survived. There was no electricity, no running water, just a rainwater tank, a battery-powered lantern, and an old radio that connected to the ranger station if the weather cooperated. No mobile reception either. Once the truck disappeared down the track, that was it. You were on your own. The nearest town was over an hour away. The ranger station was closer, but still far enough that if something went wrong, nobody was getting there quickly. I arrived just after lunch on a Monday, unlocked the cabin, dropped my gear inside, then spent the afternoon checking my equipment for the week ahead. GPS camera, survey markers, maps, notebook, everything exactly where it should be. Outside, the mountains stretched further than I could see. Layer after layer of forest disappearing into a blue autumn haze. It was beautiful. The kind of place that reminded you how small you really were. That evening, I lit the stove, heated a can of soup, and sat on the porch while the sun disappeared behind the ridgeline. The forest slowly changed. The birds stopped calling. The wind settled. Before long, there was almost no sound at all. People think silence is relaxing. Out there, it isn't. Silence has a way of making every little noise seem important. A twig snapping, leaves moving. The cabin settling as the temperature dropped. I'd stayed in places like that before, so none of it bothered me. By 10 o'clock, I was in bed. The old wall clock ticked steadily above the bedroom door. I remember checking it one last time before turning off the lantern. 10:03 p.m. I fell asleep almost immediately. The next morning I covered nearly 10 miles on foot. The survey was going well. By sunset I was exhausted. I cooked dinner, updated my notes, checked in with the ranger station over the radio. Everything normal, nothing unusual to report. Looking back, that's probably the last normal evening I had in that cabin, because sometime after I'd fallen asleep, something woke me. At first, I couldn't work out what it was. I lay there in the darkness, listening. Then I heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. The first thing I did was look at the clock. 2:17 a.m. exactly. For a few seconds, I just lay there, half asleep, trying to make sense of what had woken me. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe I'd been dreaming. Then, knock, knock, score, any knock. 3 slow knocks, not loud, not aggressive, just deliberate. I sat up immediately. Every explanation that went through my mind was perfectly ordinary. Another forestry worker, a ranger, maybe a hiker who'd gotten lost after dark. It wouldn't have been smart, but people do stupid things in the mountains all the time. I reached for the lantern on the bedside table and switched it on. The cabin filled with a warm yellow glow. Everything looked exactly as I'd left it. My boots by the door, my jacket hanging from a hook, my survey map spread across the kitchen table. Nothing felt wrong. I walked to the front window first. Outside, nothing. Just darkness, the porch, the trees, a light breeze moving the branches. I couldn't see anyone. Still, if someone had knocked, I wasn't going to ignore them. I unlocked the front door and pulled it open. Cold air rushed inside. The porch was empty. I stepped outside. The lantern lit only a few meters ahead of me. Beyond that, the forest swallowed everything. Easily could have been a deer. I remember muttering to myself. I walked around the cabin anyway. Checked the water tank, the woodshed, the truck. Nothing. No voices, no footsteps, no flashlight moving through the trees. Eventually, I convinced myself I'd overreacted. Cabins make noise, wood expands, branches scrape against walls. When you're tired enough, your brain fills in the blanks. I went back inside, locked the door, and somehow managed to fall asleep again. The next morning, the whole thing felt ridiculous. I made coffee, packed my gear, and spent another full day walking the survey route. By late afternoon, I'd already covered more ground than I'd expected. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, cool air. Exactly what you want when you're spending 10 hours climbing ridgelines. Every now and then, I'd think about the knocking, then I'd laugh at myself. I was 31 years old. I worked in forests for a living. If every strange noise scared me, I'd never get any work done. That evening, I checked in with the ranger station over the radio. "Everything going all right out there?" the dispatcher asked. "Couldn't be better," I said. "You getting any company?" I smiled. "Not unless the squirrels have started knocking." He laughed. "Told you it'd be quiet." "Quiet's good." It usually is. The radio crackled for a moment, then went silent. I cooked dinner, read a few pages of an old paperback I'd brought with me, fed another log into the stove. By 10:30, I was asleep again. I don't know what made me wake up the second night. This time, there weren't any knocks. Not at first. There was only silence. The kind that makes you realize you've been listening for something without even knowing it. I rolled over, opened one eye, and looked at the clock. 2:17 a.m. Then knock, knock, knock. I didn't move this time. I just lay there, watching the clock. 2:17 a.m. The lantern was still sitting on the bedside table. I reached over, switched it on, and waited. Nothing. No footsteps, no voices, no wind against the walls. Just the ticking of the old clock. I slipped out of bed, walked quietly into the kitchen, and stopped beside the front window. The porch was empty. The lantern reflected off the glass just enough that I had to cup my hand against it to see outside. Nothing. The trees stood perfectly still. I unlocked the door, opened it slowly, and listened. Cold air, dead silence. I stepped onto the porch. The forest looked exactly as it had the night before. Dark, quiet, ordinary. I even walked to the edge of the clearing and swept the lantern across the tree line. Nothing looked out of place. Eventually, I shook my head, laughed to myself, and went back inside. I remember thinking, whatever's making that noise, I'm not going to lose sleep over it. By morning, I'd almost convinced myself it had been an animal. I made coffee, loaded my backpack, locked the cabin behind me, then stopped halfway down the porch steps. The ground was still damp from the rain that had passed through over the weekend, soft enough to leave clear impressions. There were boot prints, not mine. Mine were already drying near the truck. These were fresh. They came out of the trees, crossed the clearing, and stopped at the bottom step of the porch. I frowned, then I looked for the return prints. There weren't any. I checked twice, walked the entire edge of the clearing. Nothing. Just one line of muddy prints, ending at the porch. I stood there for a good minute trying to make sense of it. The most obvious explanation was that I'd missed something. Maybe the ground had dried in one direction. Maybe leaves had covered the other tracks. Maybe I'd simply overlooked them. So I got down on one knee, looked closer. The impressions were sharp. Heavy hiking boots, deep heel marks. Whoever made them had been carrying weight. I followed every print again. The last one ended less than a foot from the first porch step. After that, nothing. No scuff marks, no drag marks, no sign that anyone had turned around. I finally checked my watch. I was already running late. Reluctantly, I grabbed my camera and took a few photographs, not because I thought anything strange had happened, because odd things in the woods usually have ordinary explanations, and photographs help you remember details. The rest of the day should have distracted me. Instead, I found myself thinking about those prints every hour or so. I'd stop what I was doing and replay the scene in my head. By late afternoon, I'd almost talked myself out of it again. That evening, I checked in over the radio. The same dispatcher answered. Everything's still quiet out there. For the most part, there was a pause. You sound tired. I didn't sleep much. He chuckled. Cabins will do that. I guess. I hesitated, then asked, has anyone been working this section this week? No. What about hikers? Trails closed until next month. I looked out the window toward the trees. So nobody should be out here. Another short pause. Not unless they ignored a lot of warning signs. That answer should have reassured me. Instead, it did the opposite. Because I hadn't imagined those footprints, and somebody had walked right up to my cabin. I just couldn't explain how they'd left. That evening, I made a decision. If something really was coming to the cabin every night at 2:17, I wanted to be awake when it happened. I wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. I just wanted an answer. After dinner, I lit the stove, filled my mug with coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with my notebook. Every so often, I'd glance at the old wall clock, 10 o'clock, 11, midnight. The cabin felt different that night, not because anything had changed, but because I was waiting. Every little sound seemed louder. The stove creaked as the metal heated and cooled. Branches brushed against the roof. Somewhere outside, an owl called once, then everything went quiet again. By 2 o'clock, I was struggling to keep my eyes open. I stood up, walked a slow lap around the cabin, checked every window, locked the front door again, even though I'd already checked it twice. Then I sat back down. The second hand on the wall clock swept forward. 2:16. I found myself holding my breath. The room was completely still. Then, knock, knock, knock. Exactly 3. Exactly the same as before. I didn't move. For several seconds, I simply listened. Nothing followed. No footsteps, no voice, no movement on the porch. I picked up the lantern, walked quietly to the front window, and looked out. The porch was empty. The clearing beyond it was lit by a pale moon. Nothing moved. I waited another minute. Still nothing. Slowly, I stepped back from the window. That's when I heard it. Ethan? I froze. The voice wasn't loud. It wasn't whispered either. It sounded almost conversational, like someone standing just outside the door, close enough that they expected me to answer. Every hair on my arm stood up. I didn't speak. The cabin was silent again. I stayed exactly where I was, listening. A full minute passed, then another. Nothing. Eventually, I forced myself to the front door. I unlocked it, opened it. The porch was empty. The clearing was empty. The tree line hadn't changed. I walked the entire perimeter of the cabin with the lantern. Nothing. No footprints. No fresh tracks. No sign that anyone had been there. I barely slept. By sunrise, I'd already decided. I'd finish the day's survey, drive back to the ranger station, and ask if there was another cabin I could use. I didn't care if it added an extra hour to the drive. I wasn't spending another night there. The survey itself went smoothly. If anything, I worked faster than usual. By late afternoon, I was packing my equipment into the truck. Before leaving, I walked back inside the cabin one last time to make sure I hadn't forgotten anything. My notebook, camera, radio, lantern, everything was there. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. The bedroom window. I stepped closer. On the outside wall, directly beneath the window, were 3 long scratches in the timber, perfectly parallel. Fresh enough that pale wood showed beneath them. I reached out and ran my fingers across the grooves. They were deep. Far too deep to have been made by a tree branch. I stood there for a long time, trying to think of a reasonable explanation. I couldn't. For the first time all week, I locked the cabin, not to keep wildlife out, but because I wasn't sure what I was leaving behind. I climbed into the truck, turned the key. The engine clicked once, then nothing. I sat there for a moment, staring at the dashboard. Then I tried the key again. Nothing, not even a slow crank, just a single click. The truck had never given me trouble before, not once. I climbed out, lifted the bonnet, and checked everything I knew how to check. Battery terminals, loose cables, fuel. Nothing looked wrong. I tried again. Click. I looked at my watch. Just after 6. There wasn't enough daylight left to hike back to the ranger station, and even if I started walking, I'd be covering unfamiliar mountain trails in the dark. That would have been far more dangerous than spending one more night in the cabin. So I unpacked my gear, lit the stove, and told myself I'd leave at first light. That evening felt different. Not because anything happened, but because nothing did. No strange noises, no uneasy feeling. The forest sounded almost normal again. By 10 o'clock, I started wondering if I'd worked myself into a state over nothing. Maybe the scratches had always been there. Maybe I'd missed the footprints. Maybe someone really had been passing through. One by one, every explanation I'd rejected started sounding reasonable again. I went to bed. For the first time in days, I slept. When I opened my eyes, the room was grey with early morning light. I reached for my watch. 6:11 a.m. I'd slept straight through the night. No knocking, no voices, nothing. I actually laughed. A quiet, embarrassed laugh. I remember thinking, you're going to feel pretty stupid when you tell this story one day. I got dressed, packed the last of my gear, slung my backpack over one shoulder, then reached for the bedroom door. Before my hand touched the handle, knock, knock, knock. 3 slow knocks on the other side of the bedroom door, inside the cabin. Every thought in my head stopped. The bedroom door opened into the kitchen. There was nobody else inside. I knew that. I'd locked the cabin myself. I stood there, unable to move. The knocks never came again. There was only silence. After what felt like several minutes, I forced myself to open the door. The kitchen was empty. The front door was still locked. Every window was still latched. Nothing had been disturbed. The cabin looked exactly as it always had. I didn't check another room. I didn't try to explain it. I picked up my bag, walked straight outside, and climbed into the truck. This time, the engine started instantly. I didn't question it. I just drove. About halfway back to the ranger station, the radio crackled to life. Ethan, it was the dispatcher. You heading back already? Yeah. Everything all right? I looked at the road ahead for a long moment before answering. Yeah. It was the easiest lie I'd ever told. I handed in my survey notes that afternoon, told them the job was finished. When they asked if I'd be available for another remote assignment before winter, I declined. A week later, I received the photographs I'd taken around the cabin. The footprints were there, every single one, leading from the tree line to the bottom step, exactly as I remembered. But something else caught my attention, something I'd somehow missed in the field. In the final photograph, the one I'd taken from the porch looking back toward the trees, there was a small wooden sign nailed to an old oak. I'd walked past it half a dozen times without noticing. The camera had captured it clearly. 3 words, "Do not answer." I still have that photograph. I've looked at it hundreds of times over the years. I've zoomed in, adjusted the brightness, even convinced myself the words were probably a trick of the light. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. I never went back to that cabin to find out. People ask why I refuse to stay alone in remote cabins now. The truth is, it isn't because of the knocking. It's because whoever was outside was polite enough to wait. And every now and then, usually just before I fall asleep, I wake up for no reason at all. I look at the clock, hoping it isn't 2:17. Then, without even thinking, I find myself listening for 3 slow knocks. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you for spending part of your night with me. If you enjoyed tonight's story, I'd really appreciate it if you left a like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps the channel grow and lets me keep bringing these stories to life. And if you've ever experienced something you still can't explain, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Until next time, stay safe, sleep well, and I'll see you again after dark. Tonight's story was sent to me by someone who asked to remain anonymous. As always, names and locations have been changed. Whether you believe it is entirely up to you. One of the first things you're taught as a wildlife officer is that tracks don't lie. People do, radios fail, maps can be out of date. But tracks tell a story. If you know what you're looking at, they'll tell you what passed through, which direction it was heading, and sometimes how long ago it was there. By my 6th year working in the Appalachian Mountains, reading tracks had become second nature. That's why what happened one afternoon in late October still bothers me. I was finishing paperwork at the ranger station when a call came through from 2 bow hunters. They'd spotted what they believed was an injured black bear several miles beyond an old hunting access trail. They said it was limping badly before disappearing into the timber. An injured bear isn't something you leave alone. If it's suffering, you find it. If it's aggressive, you warn anyone heading into the area. I loaded my pack, grabbed my radio, and drove out to the trailhead. The hunters had already gone, but they'd tied a strip of orange survey tape to a low branch where the trail began. It wasn't a route many people used anymore. Fallen trees had narrowed the path, and wet leaves covered almost every patch of ground. About 20 minutes in, I found the first boot prints. They were fresh enough that the edges were still sharp. Whoever had made them couldn't have been far ahead. That didn't surprise me. Plenty of hunters use those trails, especially that time of year. I kept walking. The tracks stayed on the trail, weaving naturally around rocks and exposed roots. Whoever I was following knew the area well. There was nothing unusual about them. Eventually, the trail reached a shallow creek. I crossed without much thought. The current wasn't strong, but it was enough to wash away anything in the mud. When I climbed the opposite bank, the boot prints continued exactly where I expected them to. I remember smiling to myself. At least I'm heading the right way. For the next 40 minutes, nothing changed. The forest was quiet. No birds, no wind. Just the sound of my boots on damp leaves. Then I stopped to check my map. When I looked back down, the footprints I'd been following were no longer in front of me. They were behind me. For a few seconds, I just stood there, trying to work out what I'd done wrong, because I could have sworn those prints had been in front of me the entire morning. Yet now they sat in the mud behind my boots, as though I'd walked straight past them without noticing. I checked my map again, then looked around to make sure I hadn't accidentally taken the wrong fork in the trail, but there wasn't another path anywhere nearby. The creek was still behind me. The ridgeline was exactly where I expected it to be, and everything around me matched the map. I laughed to myself, convinced I'd simply lost track of where I'd been looking, then turned around and continued uphill. A few minutes later, I found the tracks again. They led away from me exactly as before, cutting through damp leaves and patches of soft earth, always staying on the narrow trail, never wandering into the trees. I remember thinking that whoever had made them must have been close enough to hear me, yet the forest remained completely silent. Not long after that, I came across another shallow creek. It wasn't marked on my map, but that wasn't unusual after heavy rain, and I stepped across without giving it much thought. When I reached the opposite bank, I stopped. There were no footprints. The mud was untouched. I took another few steps forward, expecting them to appear again, but the trail ahead was clean. Naturally, I assumed whoever I'd been following had left the path, so I turned around to look for a place where they might have disappeared into the trees. That's when I saw them. The footprints continued behind me. Every single one of them. They hadn't vanished. They had simply started on the opposite side of the creek. I crouched down for the first time that day and actually studied one of the prints instead of just following it. It was a standard hiking boot, about the same size as mine, with a worn tread that suggested it had seen plenty of miles. There was nothing unusual about it, and yet something felt wrong enough that I couldn't explain it. I stood up and looked farther along the trail, letting my eyes follow the line of prints until they disappeared around a bend between the pines. Then I noticed the detail I should have seen an hour earlier. Every print was facing me, not one of them pointed away. Whoever had made those tracks hadn't been walking deeper into the forest. They had been walking out, which meant I hadn't spent the afternoon following someone at all. I'd been walking directly into the path of someone who should have already passed me. And somehow, they never did. I wish I could tell you I figured it out. I didn't. I stood there for what felt like a full minute, just staring at those prints, trying to convince myself I was reading them wrong, so I picked one, knelt down, brushed the leaves away with my glove. There was no mistake. The heel was closest to me. The toes pointed straight at my boots. I checked the next one, then the next. Every single print told the same story. Someone had walked out of those woods. Nodding, I looked up the trail. Nothing, no movement, no sound, just trees. The sensible part of my brain kept searching for an explanation. Maybe I'd somehow turned around without realizing. Maybe I'd crossed another trail. Maybe the light was playing tricks on me. So I pulled out my GPS. It took a few seconds to lock onto my position when it did. The screen confirmed exactly what I already knew. I'd never left the trail. I'd been walking in the same direction all afternoon. I don't mind admitting, that's the moment I decided the bear could wait. I turned around, started back the way I'd come. Didn't run, just walked to steady. I kept telling myself there had to be an explanation. People don't simply disappear in the middle of an open trail. After 10 minutes, I reached the creek again, the one where I'd first noticed something wasn't right. I crossed, climbed the opposite bank, then looked back one last time. The mud was smooth. No footprints, not mine, not anyone else's. Just untouched earth, as though nobody had crossed it all day. I stood there longer than I should have. Then I got back to my truck, drove straight to the ranger station. Finished my report, left out everything about the footprints. Who's going to believe that I told them I never found the bear? That part was true. A week later, another officer searched the same trail. He didn't find a bear either. He didn't find any tracks these days. I'm not a wildlife officer anymore. I still spend plenty of time outdoors. I still hunt every autumn. I still trust what I can see. But if I'm alone and I come across a line of footprints leading into the Appalachian woods, I leave them exactly where I found them, because sometimes the safest trail is the one you never follow. Thank you for listening to tonight's story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to Coal After Dark, and let me know in the comments where tonight's story took you. Until next time, sleep well.
That brings us to the end of tonight's collection. Whether you believe these stories were real, legends passed down through generations, or simply the imagination of the people who experienced them, I'll leave that up to you. One thing is certain. The Appalachian Mountains have a way of making ordinary people question what they thought they knew. If you enjoyed spending the last hour with me, I'd really appreciate it if you left a like and subscribed to the channel. It helps Coal After Dark reach more people who enjoy slow burn horror and true style scary stories. And if you've experienced something you still can't explain, I'd love to hear it. Leave a comment below or send your story to the email in the description. It might become a future episode. Until next time, sleep well. And if you ever find yourself alone on a quiet mountain trail, trust your instincts. Good night.